Greetings from the National Archives. I'm David Ferriero, Archivist of the United States, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this virtual book talk with Denise Kiernan, author of We Gather Together, A Nation Divided, A President in Turmoil, and a Historic Campaign to Embrace Gratitude and Grace. Today's program is presented in partnership with the Lincoln Group of the District of Columbia, and we thank them for their support. Our annual Thanksgiving holiday is just 2 days away. This year will be very different from past years as we attempt to adapt to a national health crisis. But the core idea of a day of Thanksgiving remains the same, taking time to reflect and express gratitude. In her book, We Gather Together, Denise Kiernan looks back over centuries of the concept of showing gratitude as a community. In our own nation, presidents have declared national days of Thanksgiving, but not as a regular recurring holiday until President Abraham Lincoln. The National Archives holdings contain the first U.S. Thanksgiving proclamation by George Washington in 1789 and subsequent ones through the presidency of Barack Obama. Lincoln's 1863 proclamation is there as well and has a central role in the book about which we are about to hear. In the mid-19th century, Sarah Josepha Hale campaigned for decades for an annual day of Thanksgiving observed throughout the United States. She finally had success with President Lincoln. His 3-page proclamation, written in the midst of the Civil War, began with an expression of gratitude for a year filled with the blessings of fruitful fields and helpful skies, and concluded with an appeal to God to heal the wounds of the nation and to restore it to the full enjoyment of peace, harmony, tranquility, and union. Since then, we have set aside a day of National Thanksgiving every November to stop and consider what makes us truly thankful. Now it is my pleasure to welcome our guest. Denise Kiernan is an author, journalist, and producer. Her best-selling books include The Last Castle and The Girls of Atomic City. She has also worked in television, serving as head writer for ABC's Who Wants to Be a Millionaire during its Emmy Award-winning first season. Karen Abbott is the author of best-selling books including American Rose and The Ghosts of Eden Park. She has appeared on the History Channel, CBS Sunday Morning, and the Discovery Channel. Now let's turn to Denise Kiernan and Karen Abbott. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us during this holiday week. Very excited to be talking about Denise Kiernan's fantastic new book, We Gather Together, and we have a lot to talk about. It's going to be a fun time tonight. And Denise and I are all very good friends as well as longtime writing partners, and we always talk about the fact that the world in which we begin a book rarely resembles the world in which the book is published. And I don't think that that's as true for any other book as much as it is for We Gather Together. The world has changed drastically since you first began this book. I'd love for you to start out by talking about the germ of this idea and how the idea evolved, and how did your work evolve as the world was really drastically changing around us?
Thank you. That's a great question to start with, and thank you so much, David Ferriero. I've had the delight of meeting the Archivist of the United States on several occasions, and thanks to the National Archives for putting this together, and thanks to Abbott for joining in with me on what is the weirdest book tour I've ever had in my life. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of times people don't realize that as writers, we come up with these germs of ideas, as you said, and we're not maybe sure it's going to be a book. So for me, I came across the story of Sarah Josepha Hale, this woman, this 19th century media maven who campaigned for a National Day of Thanks. I came across her story years ago while I was working on another book. But as you know, and people who read my books know, I don't necessarily do straight up biographies. But I was so compelled by this woman's story, I did what I always do, which is start a file.
Right.
I have written files, I have email files, Post-its running around the office, and I sort of set it aside. And, I'm always, as a writer, kind of more interested in the intersection of stories and characters and events as much or even more so than the individual characters and events themselves. And the intersection between Sarah Josepha Hale and Abraham Lincoln certainly was fascinating to me. The intersection between the Civil War and the establishment of the American National Day of Thanks that has continued to what we know to be Thanksgiving today, that intersection was interesting. And the intersection between Sarah Josepha Hale and so many other writers and media personalities, that was interesting. But to me, there was still kind of something missing, and I wasn't quite ready to do this book. And on a personal level, and also as a researcher and someone interested in science, I have found the last decade or so, the research that's been done into gratitude and having a gratitude practice has been really fascinating to me. In the last
whole self-care industry.
Exactly, but you know what's so interesting is that in the last decade or so, there is hard scientific research on a neurological level that looks at the mental, the emotional, and even the physical benefits to having a gratitude practice. And I thought, well, gosh, that's what a Thanksgiving is. That's what a Thanksgiving has been since humans have walked the earth. The idea that we are going to take time to appreciate that which has been given to us. And to me, the gratitude piece was kind of the linchpin for me. So I wanted to look at American history, in a sense, through the lens of our relationship to gratitude and giving thanks. But still, even though once I had decided that's how I wanted to do the book, you know, you do your outlines. I'm a big outliner. Some people
we'll get into the craft.
Yeah, I'm a big outliner. You know, you tweak your outline, you talk to your editor, it gets tweaked again, you write it, you revise it again. And like you said, I mean, the world is different, you know, from when you conceive a book to when it hits the shelves. But oh my gosh, when I was proofing a book titled We Gather Together and the phrase social distancing was trending, I just thought, what is going on? And it was a pretty surreal. This has been a pretty surreal experience for me.
Yeah, we gathered together through Zoom.
Yes,
this
exactly.
year.
But that's kind of the point, right? I mean, that's what she was saying. You know, you might not be those. You know, people in the 19th century couldn't necessarily be in the same room with people all over the country or all over the world. But Sarah Josepha Hale thought it would still be powerful and moving and unifying if everybody just sort of knew on that one day, everybody in their country was going to get together and take a minute to just say thank you.
Now, before we get into Sarah, because she's such a rich, fascinating, fabulous character, I just want to say that some of my favorite parts of the book are your own first-person experiences. You have such a witty, wonderful, funny voice and really insightful anecdotes, I think, that really sort of bolster the larger idea that you're presenting about a new kind of Thanksgiving story. If you could just tell some of your favorite experiences of celebrating Thanksgiving abroad and that whole situation.
Yes, you know, I love Thanksgiving, and I want to feel good about what Thanksgiving is, which was one of the impetuses for writing this book. But I've lived abroad a couple times in my life. I've lived in France briefly, and I've lived in Italy twice. And to me, it's always interesting how American I feel when I'm not in America, like how much of an American I feel when I'm not here. And I've lived in Rome twice, Rome, Italy. It's a very special place to me. And trying to have Thanksgiving, you want to go it's Thanksgiving, and you think to yourself, well, it's the end of November. It's Thanksgiving, right? I've got to have Thanksgiving. And you get your expat friends together, and then you realize, when I lived in Rome, which is more years ago than I need to share, but Oh my gosh, cranberries. They don't get, what are cranberries?
Right.
You can't find cranberries. So you're trying to contact people who know people at the Food and Agriculture Organization.
It's like cranberry smuggling underground.
It was hilarious. But it was a really unique moment. And then, I remember having this very strange Thanksgiving in Paris and at a French friend's apartment. And we went looking for a turkey and le dinde, and we found one, and we looked at this turkey and I thought, that is the smallest turkey I've ever seen in my life. And we get it all the way back to my friend's apartment and it won't fit in the oven. And so we have to cook this turkey and the oven door won't shut. And turkeys take long enough with like the oven door shut.
Yes.
But it was just one of those things where you thought there is something about this holiday that speaks to me and continues to. But I was really interested in, I've known for a while that the history we grew up with Thanksgiving,
right,
hot as kids, wasn't real and on point. And I wanted to dig into that. And,
right.
And then, putting together Sarah Josepha Hale's piece with the Civil War just really kind of made this holiday that I already enjoyed just feel a little truer. And in a sense, the concept of, and I get into this in the book, I talk about ancient Rome. I talk about all of these, Thanksgivings that, by years and years and years predate anything we've conceived of on this continent.
Right.
They're meaningful, and you can kind of see that. I kind of described it as an evolution in a sense.
Well, let's talk about Sarah Josepha Hale. She's a huge part of this book, a fascinating woman, a flawed woman, a complicated woman. Tell me a little bit about her origins, and how did the idea for Thanksgiving become this driving force in her life? And how did she go about accomplishing this and bringing it all the way to the Lincoln White House?
We have this, the word Thanksgiving, the practice of Thanksgiving, like I said, goes back, almost till since humans have walked the earth. Sarah Josepha Hale grew up in the early 19th century in America. Her father was a Revolutionary War veteran, so she grew up with a very strong, and he was injured during the Revolutionary War. She grew up with a very strong love of what it meant for the United States of America to exist.
Yeah.
She also, she grew up, it was a difficult time. An older brother was lost at sea. She lost her mother and a sister, at a young age. And, she didn't have the benefit of what, we would consider to be education. However, she did consider herself lucky to grow up in a house where they loved books and loved reading, and they did so voraciously. One of her older brothers had the benefit of going off to Dartmouth to study. When he came home, he would share what he learned with his sister, Sarah.
Yeah, I thought that was really touching. He was invested in her education.
It was so lovely. And you could really see how important those kinds of conversations and reading and discussion of all those things were in her life. And then she married a man, David Hale, who, also saw in her this woman who loved to write, this woman who loved to read. They had study hour every night between 8 and 10. They would sit in their parlor and they would talk about French, or they would talk about botany or books they were interested in. And Sarah's husband, David, knew she wrote and didn't just encourage her to keep writing, encouraged her to put her work out into the world. And this is the 1820s.
Yeah.
And she does. And she sadly loses him early on in their marriage. He got pneumonia, which is still a killer, but was definitely a killer then. And she was a widowed mother of 5 and needed to make a living. And she started putting her work out into the world. And she wrote a novel in 1827 called Northwood that got enough attention to get her a position as the editor of a ladies' magazine. And in that novel, she shares a scene. It's a fictional book. But there is a scene, almost an entire chapter dedicated to a Thanksgiving meal. And you can see through the experiences of her fictional characters, how meaningful this day of coming together was to her. And as she grew her influence as a magazine editor and an author of her own right, and a poetess, and someone who anthologized other people's work and put them out in the world, you can see her dedication to that idea of a singular day of thanks. Because in the early 19th century, you would have, it seems so strange, actually, when we think Thanksgiving is such a big part of America now, it seems strange to think about a time when Massachusetts might have Thanksgiving on one day, and New York
scattered.
It might have it on another day, and some places might not have it at all, and it was kind of all over the map. And that just became one of her campaigns. And I say one because even though she was so influential when it came to the creation of our American National Day of Thanks, she also campaigned for women's education.
Yeah.
She also campaigned to raise money for the widows of people lost at sea. She was always using this position that I think she felt lucky to have as someone with no education who was editing a magazine to bring attention. And I think if
she was a literary influencer. I mean, mention some of the people that she published.
Oh my gosh, yes, exactly. And if you think about who she would be if she were around today, we would call her an influencer, right? She'd be one of those people who had 1 million Instagram followers.
Exactly.
Yeah. Telling people but she wasn't only just trying to sell copies of her magazine. She was telling people how to take care of their kids, what kind of exercise they should have.
But she was sort of pushing all of the great male writers of that time period.
Yes,
if you're going to talk about any of them.
Oh yeah. So I mean, she wanted at that time in history, in the mid 19th century, it was pretty common for magazines. There were what they called scissor editors. People would clip out articles or pieces or essays from other magazines and kind of curate them and put them out in their own publication. And when she came on board with these ladies' magazines, she was like, no, we're going to publish original stuff. And so, one of my favorite anecdotes of hers was she published a story by a very young, unknown writer that, and the magazine said of this writer's work, it's young and the prose is boyish and it is wanting some, maturity, etc. But he shows signs of genius and is, could be no less a poet than Shelley. And this is what her magazine said. And it turns out this young writer went to West Point with her son, David. So David writes his mother, Sarah Hale, and says, I showed my classmate what your magazine said about his writing. And, so I told Edgar Allan Poe.
Yes, who would get kicked out of West Point eventually, but yeah.
Who would get kicked out of West Point because he was not
a soldier.
This was the beginning. Nobody knew who Edgar Allan Poe was. And this was the beginning of a lifelong, for Poe, lifelong relationship with, writer-editor relationship with Sarah Josepha Hale. The Cask of Amontillado was published.
That's amazing. I love that.
It cracks me up because you just imagine these ladies, reading about dress patterns and, how to set a table and then someone getting walled up in a crib.
Exactly. A little balance in your reading. You just need a little balance.
But she was such a voracious reader and so interested in presenting unique ideas to the public that she recognized these things and she was willing to put them out there. And she also, in addition to supporting her 5 kids as a widow and running a magazine, created anthologies of women writers. I mean, yes, she was one of the first publishers of Nathaniel Hawthorne and Washington Irving and Edgar Allan Poe and Ralph Waldo Emerson. But she also created anthologies that included people like Lydia Maria Child and Grace Greenwood and all these amazing women writers. And so, influencers today, might be selling a product, but she was actually in so many ways lifting up other people. And this, was her passion, along with, Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving was her big.
Yeah. So let's get back to her crusade with Thanksgiving and bring it into the Civil War. I know we want to see the wonderful 1863 proclamation, if anybody can show that.
Yeah. So Sarah Hale decided that, we had all of these different kinds of Thanksgivings were proclaimed on different days in different states in different years. And she wanted Thanksgiving to be in America, to be one day, the same day every year, and everybody celebrated it on the same day. So she starts writing about it in her books. She writes about it in her magazine, in her editor's column. And she starts writing governors and the heads of territories and, ambassadors in other countries and saying, please, can't we all get on board and do this? And then she starts writing presidents. Taylor and Fillmore and Pierce and Buchanan, asking them to proclaim, a national day of thanks, and they didn't get on board. And then in 1863, she writes not just Abraham Lincoln, she also writes his Secretary of State Seward, which I think was a brilliant move. And Seward in his autobiography, says to Lincoln, hey, these states complain we're taking away their rights. There's another right we can take away from them. And Lincoln says, well, what's that? And he says, the right to proclaim a national day of Thanksgiving. And so in 1863, Lincoln answers Sarah Josepha Hale's plea to proclaim a national day of thanks throughout the United States of America. And if we could see that, because there were so many wonderful documents at the archives that I was able to look at, so many presidential papers.
Yeah.
And if we can share do we have the proclamation?
Yeah. I think it's up there.
Or is everybody seeing it and we're not?
Yeah, I think everybody's seeing it. So
I'm sorry. Okay. So I'm waiting for it to be shown, but I can't see it. Okay.
No, it's okay. But
you're looking at it. Okay.
One of my favorite parts of the book too, where if you could just talk about get a little bit more in depth on that first Civil War, Thanksgiving, as scattered as it was, there were so many wonderful things happening in little pockets of the country. Just could share a few of your favorite anecdotes there.
One of the things that was interesting to me was the way that Thanksgiving served as, kind of a lens through which to examine really American culture and the evolution of the American experience throughout the 19th and 20th century, and even coming into the 21st. The year before Lincoln agreed to proclaim a national Thanksgiving in 1862, there was a Thanksgiving dinner where the discussion of the Massachusetts 54th Regiment took place, the creation of the first all-black regiment in the Civil War. If anybody saw the movie Glory, that was about the Massachusetts 54th. One of the seeds that created the Massachusetts 54th, that came to be at a Thanksgiving dinner in Boston. The year that, Lincoln proclaimed this National Day of Thanksgiving, and you think about that, I was talking before about the intersection of events and people, the idea that a unifying day of saying thank you finally came to pass in the middle of one of the most, divisive times ever in this country, to me is so powerful and interesting. And you have people like Sojourner Truth going door to door to raise money to be able to provide a Thanksgiving meal for troops in bivouacked outside Detroit. That's one of my favorite stories.
Yeah, that was amazing. Yeah, and Clara Barton is there.
Say again?
Oh, Clara Barton is there.
Yeah, Clara Barton's Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving's celebrated in the field. Soldiers writing about either things were quiet. I mean, you have Confederate soldiers writing, things were quiet because our enemy was celebrating Thanksgiving. And it's almost like everybody kind of just took a moment.
They did what you're supposed to do on Thanksgiving, and they chilled out for a day, right?
Yeah. Then you have, soldiers. Thomas Nast was one of the,
Right.
Illustrator who did so many illustrations during this period in time. And his Thanksgiving illustrations captured a lot of this stuff, people celebrating Thanksgiving in the field, on ships at sea, and charity started to take hold.
Right.
People raising money so that people could have a Thanksgiving meal in hospitals, and all those sorts of things during that Civil War era of Thanksgiving, when our National Day of Thanks took root, and the Thanksgiving we know began and continues on to today. They're really quite inspirational when you watch people find a way to be grateful in the midst of horrific times, and bringing that back to what I consider to be like the linchpin of why I wanted to do this book, the concept of gratitude. There's a lot of research that shows that the ability to maintain a sense of thankfulness and gratefulness when things are going their worst is incredibly important to the resilience of the human spirit. And I think what I was trying to do throughout this book was show that resilience, and how it manifested in the Civil War into the early 20th century.
And to that point, let's talk for a minute about the Spanish flu. I mean, how were people celebrating Thanksgiving during the Spanish flu, which, is very eerily similar to what we're going through this week?
Okay, so that was one of those, we were talking at the top of the conversation about how books land in worlds that are very different than the world in which you conceive them. And the Spanish flu of 1918 and Thanksgiving during the Spanish flu was one of those parts when we were going through and proofreading and getting ready to put this book out into the world that we were all just looking, thinking, oh my gosh, what on earth? So, there were a lot of similarities. People were, the flu wasn't new. People were tired of it. They were tired of quarantine. They were tired of staying away from people. On the tail end of Armistice Day, and wanting to kind of revel in the fact that a war was over and be able to celebrate with loved ones. People wanted to be close with one another. They wanted to get together, and the advice from health professionals and civic leaders was, please don't do that.
Yes.
We're canceling a lot of,
sage advice. Yes.
Stay home. It is eerily similar, and you see the advice, and I love going back, as I know you do, and looking at old newspaper articles.
My
gosh.
There's no better window into a different era than that. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, seeing what was on the front page, what were people focusing on, what were people concerned about. And so there were all of this is canceled, that is canceled. Please don't attend any large gatherings, celebrate in your homes, keep the spirit of the holiday, et cetera, et cetera. And there was one article I came across that's in the book. And it was this, and it's one of the ones that for me is most memorable. And it was this one family dinner, and not a big family dinner either, but people who didn't live in the same house, and they came together for this Thanksgiving meal. And that one meal resulted in 27 severe cases of Spanish flu.
Yeah.
And you see it, and it's quite striking. And then there was even an article about Santa. The Santa appearance in Minneapolis was going to be canceled because Santa got the flu. And it is really quite. I mean, you talk about history repeating itself, but I mean, it was really quite eerie and quite telling to go back and look at that. But again. Throughout that, throughout rationing for World War I and throughout the Spanish flu, you see these moments of charity and of kind of, figuring out a way to be thankful for what you have. And then, we go, forward into World War II, where, Thanksgiving still wasn't a congressional holiday. It wasn't a congressionally established holiday. It was not a federal holiday until World War II. And I just think it's so interesting that the Thanksgiving we're familiar with got its start during the Civil War, and was congressionally established during World War II. So you see this ongoing evidence of a commitment to give thanks when things are going horribly, and that's the kind of message that even though I didn't know this book was going to land in this particular world, that's the kind of message that still feels just so incredibly relevant and poignant today.
Definitely. So we have a couple questions. Want to start getting into the questions here.
Sure.
One of them is one I'm interested in as well because it's such a beautifully researched book. So talk about some of the sources for your research, and you and I, in sort of a compound question, you and I always talk about world building in nonfiction. We're not allowed to make up dialogue. We're not allowed to make up characters. We're not allowed to make up events. We can't combine anything. We can't play with the timeline. It's a lot harder than just, although fiction has its own challenges, but making things up in your mind, and sometimes the dead people don't do what you want them to do.
They don't tell you what you want them to tell you.
Yeah.
They don't say what you want them to say.
Yeah. So talk about your world building and your sources. People want to hear about your sources.
Yeah. So, world building often gets talked about a lot when we talk about science fiction and fantasy. You have to really buy into Middle Earth if you're going to go on that adventure with Frodo, right? You've really got to feel Middle Earth. And I'm a Lord of the Rings, nerd, so that I get that. And for nonfiction, narrative nonfiction, like you and I write, you want to feel like you're time traveling. You want to feel like you're sinking into.
Otherwise, what's the point, right?
Absolutely. And that's what takes you away. And in going away to that other moment in time, you're able to not only experience a different world, but I think you're also best able to recognize the similarities of the human experience in the 21st century versus, in this case, the 19th century. There were many resources. Thank goodness for the National Archives. The presidential papers, I get into George Washington's papers, John Adams' papers, John Quincy Adams' papers, Jefferson's papers, Roosevelt's papers, and all of those. There were some wonderful diary entries, including some of John Adams during the various Thanksgivings, prior to Hale's crusade. Thanksgiving for repeal of the stamp tax, he put in his diary once. And it was like that was something they would proclaim a Thanksgiving for, Sam Adams proclaiming Thanksgivings. Then, of course, the proclamations, Lincoln's papers, Hale's letter.
Well, let me talk about Hale for a second. We also, since you and I write about women a lot, we talk about the difficulty in writing about women because their archives, their letters, their writings were often discarded or considered unimportant.
And hers were too.
They were. So talk about researching her.
A lot of them were. Luckily, she was interesting because sometimes she revealed the most about herself in her magazine editorials and in the introductions to her various books. And she wrote a lot of books. She was one of these people where I was looking through everything she wrote, and all I could think was, my God, what have I been doing with my time? She just kept going and going and going. So, for example, she put together a wonderful anthology called The Lady's Wreath, which was an anthology of American poetesses. So she brought attention to all of these wonderful American writers, American female writers, and she wrote her own biography as the editor of this book, and shared how she felt about losing her husband, and shared how she felt the first time she saw a woman author, a woman as the author of a book, how she felt as a kid reading that. Talked about how important her kids were to her, how important education was, because even though she wasn't left with a lot of money when her husband passed away, and she talks about that, she wanted more than anything to make sure that they had an education, because if they did not have that, they would be, quote, poor indeed. So there were a lot of really wonderful insights that came from her actual writings. Luckily, blessedly, I'm sitting here and looking at on the floor of, I have a bound copy of Godey's Ladies magazine for all of 1863. I have an actual 1863 copy.
That's amazing. And you should be framing that and hanging that on your wall. That's amazing.
Yes, and I would get up and go get it, but I'm so deathly afraid of like tripping over ring lights and everything that goes on now in this crazy world that we're in.
Yeah.
So many of the things that she published happily have been scanned, in her case, by places like Happy Trust, which is a really wonderful resource. But when it came to, presidential proclamations and presidential letters, the National Archives was incredible. One of the things that New York Public Library Manuscripts and Archives Division, where I've done research for every single book I've ever done, had wonderful files on the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which was a really influential organization, volunteer organization during the Civil War. Parts of those holdings are the handwritten letter by Dr. Leal, who was the first doctor to come upon Lincoln when he was shot.
Oh, yes, the handwritten, yeah.
Yeah, Lincoln's assassination is in my book. That was incredible. And when you see, I mean, to me, like, to see handwriting is such a special thing. Yeah. And you know, as I do, when you start researching people for a certain amount of time, when I was working on The Last Castle, for example, which was my last book about Biltmore Estate and the Vanderbilt family, I could spot Edith Vanderbilt's handwriting in a second. I mean, you look at it so much, and you see the postmarks and all of those wonderful things. And then I think about, I don't know, this is a whole other conversation, but I think about archives now and emails, like archiving emails. There's something, it's just something missing that's, I still write on, I have stationery in my. I know.
I don't envy the historians coming 150 years after us. I will say that, dealing with archives.
Yeah.
So we have another question here. Did Sarah receive much recognition in her life?
No, she didn't. Not that I could come across. Not the kind of recognition. I think, in my opinion, no. Some people, people might differ with me. Certainly not the kind of recognition we're familiar with today, where, basically Lincoln proclaimed Thanksgiving, and it wasn't Lincoln proclaimed Thanksgiving because of this amazing woman who did X, Y, and Z. It was just Lincoln proclaimed Thanksgiving.
Right.
On and on it went. And she kept writing presidents because she knew, and she said this in her magazine, we need this to be an actual law. We need this to be congressionally established. Otherwise, it's always going to be at the whim of a president and then governors of states and heads of territories to follow suit with whatever the president proclaimed. And, she never saw that come to pass. So she kept writing presidents right up until, Rutherford B. Hayes, right up until the last president who was alive, at the time of her death. And years later, you would see, and I get into this in the book a little, you would see how the further away we got from 1863, you could see how the media started to remember Thanksgiving and write about Thanksgiving. And there were a couple of places that mentioned Hale, but a lot of places that didn't. So she was a very influential editor during her time. When she died, I will say this, when she died, the obituaries far and wide talked about what an incredible editor she was, how influential she was. Not all of them mentioned Thanksgiving,
which is kind of astounding.
It's really interesting. So,
yeah.
It was interesting to see that. I don't think she cared. I really don't think.
She was happy that it happened. She didn't need to hear anything else about it. She was good.
Yep.
You sort of paint a lovely, and people who buy the book and see the scene, but this sort of nice picture of content. Her life sort of ends just the way you wish it would end for her.
Yeah, it does. And I'm not going to, I think it's I think the end of her life is quite lovely. And yes, I'm not going to say.
Yeah, don't say any more. Well, we could talk about craft more. There is a question, is there anything else to share about the Sojourner Truth part of the story? Anything else you could share about her contributions during the...
There is, and there's so many, I get into some of the contributions of Native Americans and Black Americans during the Civil War. Frederick Douglass and his sons are in my book. They have they come through during the Civil War. It talked about the Massachusetts 54th. Harriet Tubman also in the story, because it, essentially this was a holiday that was meant to, unify everyone, and certainly the Civil War and the impact that the outcome of that war had on the lives of enslaved people was significant. Sojourner Truth, one of my favorite anecdotes was she's literally going door to door, and she's 60 something at this point, to raise money for a regiment of all Black soldiers that are bivouacked outside of Detroit so they can have a Thanksgiving meal. And the event itself gets shared in the newspaper, and she gave a speech, and it's really beautiful. But she writes in her autobiography that she goes to this one man's door, and she didn't always get a lovely reception when she was going door to door. And in this particular case, this man had many things to say to her, various racial epithets, various, things to say about, the war, etc. And she said, well, what is your name? And he said, I am the only son of my mother. And she just looked at him and said, I'm glad there are no more, and walked off.
Oh, brilliant.
Hey! But then she does raise money for the troops to have a lovely Thanksgiving where they were, as good as they could. And she gave a lovely speech, and it was covered in the papers. So that was one of my favorite Sojourner Truth stories. And it's funny in these books, because I do like to bring in, like I said, I love the intersection of people. So, there's Frederick Douglass and Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman's a big part of this book. And Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman and all these folks. And you kind of want to be able to they're all so amazing. And you want to be able to, just go and talk about each one of them.
There's so many rich details, and you sort of seamlessly weave.
So many, and writing is so much, as so much of writing is not necessarily what you put in, but what you leave out, and it's the hard part. But it's what you got to do.
One more craft question, and then I just want to ask you this, because I think it's always an interesting discussion. People often ask it for me, and I have a whole long story about why I do what I do, and I'm curious about your process. Do you research and write at the same time, or are you separation of church and state? You must research and you must write, or is it sort of an integral process that you sort of go?
For me, it happens at the same. It shifts. So, like, if this is the process, at the beginning, this much is research and this much is writing. And then as you move on, like, this much is writing and this much is research.
Yeah.
And because what happens, and I'm a big, I don't know if you or people watching are familiar with mind mapping, but I'm a big mind mapper.
I am not. I have to pick your mind about this later.
Yes. So it's kind of a circular way at looking at ideas. So I get these giant whiteboards, and I'm not talking about like the kinds of whiteboards you could buy at, an office store that might be, 3x4, 3x5. I go to Lowe's or Home Depot, and I get giant, like construction size dry erase boards that take up almost my entire living room floor. And I will put a timeline across the top, and then I'll put themes and characters, and then I just start drawing arrows.
And then you turn into John Nash.
to connect, and then you start to connect people and events and things, and you sort of start to see
the connection.
Themes that way. But I always start off with a skeletal. I always start off with an outline. The outline sometimes goes right out the window, but I do start out with one because I need to know I need to know there's a way to get where I want to go. But yeah, the thing is, as you start looking into, even after you've started writing, even after a first draft, or even a second draft, there are always things that kind of tickle your brain, and I can't help but look into them. And I'm horrible, and I don't think editors love me for this. I'm always like, I got to squeeze this in. I got to find a place for this, because you find all these.
That's what makes you so good, because the details are what make narrative nonfiction. So that's what makes narrative nonfiction come alive.
Right. I mean, that's what makes you feel sort of like you're in a that world building thing we were talking about. But yeah, so I do a lot of outlining, I write and research at the same time, but I definitely do. Well, even before I decide what book I'm going to do, and I know you're the same way, you've got to know there's enough out there.
Yeah.
Right? You've got to know
the primary source materials. Yeah.
Yeah. You got to know there's enough source material, or else you don't want to go down that road. So you actually, before you've started writing the book, you've already done actually a lot of, even before you propose the book to an editor, you've already done a lot of research. But so it's like the percentage kind of shifts. But I write in the morning. I'm a morning writer. Get up, got to write before everything starts to come at me. And then, but research is so fun. I mean, I can stay, I can sit in, the National Archives of the Library of Congress, or the, New York, Brown University. I mean, there's so many wonderful archives.
It's like you're a detective on the search.
It's so awesome. Yeah. It's so wonderful. It's such a tremendous resource that we all have. And there's just I think of all the stuff that I've come across. I think of all the stuff that you've come across and other writers we know. And then I think of all the papers and records that nobody's looked at yet. And it's like there's just this gold mine of wonderful stories about the American experience that are just out.
I can tell you have things percolating already for your next. To be continued.
Yes.
Okay, one more question, and then we are going to close out. But I want everybody out there to know Denise is not only a fantastic and brilliant writer, she is also an amazing cook. What is on your table this Thanksgiving? What are you doing?
Okay, so Thanksgiving's a big deal in this house. Normally, the day is happening. Like, I am cooking. I actually have 2 turkeys. I went to pick them up today. We get them from a local farmer. So literally I saw these turkeys were running around. I make stuffing. I do my stuffing in muffin tins. I make stuffing.
Oh, that's fancy.
Okay. It's not actually. The whole thing about the stuffing muffin, because it's not yeast, so it doesn't rise. So you can just pack muffin tins really, really high. And then so much of it, you get this wonderful crispy to moist ratio when you do stuffing muffins that way. But the better part is I'm big into Thanksgiving leftovers, and stuffing muffins in the fridge. You take them out, you cut them in half, and then they are sandwich bread, and you put turkey on it. And so then the stuffing muffins actually become the bread for leftover turkey sandwiches. Usually we have a big Thanksgiving leftover party here at the house on Saturday. Families that we know come by with their kids, and we have all kinds of leftovers, and people drop in, and we decorate. I start the tree on the Saturday after Thanksgiving. That's not happening this year. It's just.
Well, you can feel free to send me leftovers in New York.
I will mail you. I mailed you jam. I mailed me jam. That's right. So I will, I'm going to be cooking like a crazy person, but then I'm going to be eating. It's just going to be my husband and I. So goodness, I'm going to be eating Thanksgiving for like 6 weeks, but I have to do it.
Well, everybody should buy your book. It's also a great holiday gift. Let's put that out there. Was there anything you wanted to plug? Your Zoom's giving on your website?
Oh, yes. For those of you who are doing what I'm doing, which is not traveling, but connecting with people this way like we are now, I actually, on my website, DeniseKiernan.com, I have a Zoom's giving page, and I have gratitude quotes and little gratitude conversation starters, and I actually have Thanksgiving-inspired Zoom backgrounds if you want to have like a little seasonal Zoom.
I think I need one of those. Yeah.
Yeah. So I thought let's do what we can. We'll all get through this. It'll be okay.
It will be okay.
Yeah, that's on my site. So, and I would love to hear from people, via my website, what they did this year, because I actually do think there are going to be a lot of really interesting traditions that evolved out of need because of everything that's going on that might actually stick around once the pandemic is gone. So,
well, I want to say thank you to the National Archives. Denise, thank you for this really enlightening and fun interview. Your book is amazing, and I'm really honored to have talked with you about it, and everybody should read it, I think.
Thank you so much. Thanks, National Archives. Thanks, Abbott, and happy holidays, everybody. Thank you so much.
Yes, happy Thanksgiving.